Hi there, boys, and 0.7% of the channel, which are girls. Welcome to another edition of Drift Crash. It's Monday, it's 7, and things came out in the wrong order, but you get the idea. So, on this week's episode of Irish Men with Beards, I am going to talk to a chap called David Egan, who is one of the head honchos from Drift Games and Drift Masters, the international drifting series that has become very well known for its particularly aggressive and wild nature. Dave is going to take us through a little bit of a journey from the start of his drifting right up to present times and what he sort of foresees for the future. So Dave is very well known within the field of drifting. He is one of the head guys at Drift Games and also from Drift Masters, the European series that's very well known for its particularly wild nature. Dave is going to take us through a bit of a journey from the start of his drifting way back when into more present times and how he sees things potentially for the future. It's also nice that Dave connects the sort of grassroots element of new people coming to drifting and the for want of a better expression, the sort of top end of drifting, and just I think there's a real nice sense of togetherness in what he's saying. So I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll see you on the other side after we've kind of done the bit where I buggered up the audio. I know I've got this real nice fancy looking mic here. I forgot to turn it on. I can only apologise for that, but I did happen to have a little headset on, so that's what the audio is coming through, and I will maybe try not to bugger that up for next week's episode. Anyway, see you in a bit.
So, Dave, welcome to Drift Crash. Thank you very much for joining us. Appreciate you coming here. How are things over in Ireland?
Things are okay. Things are strange like they are everywhere else in the world. We're making do with trying to stay creative, but obviously we're all isolated in our homes at the moment. So it's been a challenging time, especially for us in a brand that does live events and, does live content sort of, and a lot of car review stuff. We obviously can't do any of those things. So we've tried to be as creative as possible, making documentaries, doing some live streams. And I suppose like everyone else, just coping as best you can and hoping it'll all go away very soon and being as optimistic as possible.
I believe that's all we can do at the moment. It is a bit of a peculiar time, but obviously we're all here still chugging away, trying to produce decent content and keep the people interested. So my outlet for that today is you. Thank you. And we're going to talk about for my sins or for your sins. And we just basically, we're going to get down to how you actually got into drifting and how you ended up in the position that you are now. Obviously, for people who aren't aware of you, who probably should be, you're probably one of the most, certainly in the current state of affairs, one of the most influential characters in drifting, in that you are now running and organising the Drift Masters Championship and the Emirates Drift Championship as well. So how the hell did you get there?
Sometimes I ask the same question, to be honest. A lot of people assume, over what we've done over the last few years, that it was some sort of plan for all of this. I would absolutely say that the first day I did in drifting, that was to be the last day I did in drifting, because it was just for something fun and it was something I got hooked on, and it sort of progressed to this level. I'd always been a big car fan ever since I was very small, since I was 4 or 5. And there's no influence of that anywhere else in my family, from my parents to uncles to nobody had any interest in cars. Just for some reason, I picked up an interest in cars, loved them. Always, was reading. Since I was 8 years of age, I was buying Top Gear magazine and reading every magazine there was and building garages and stuff like that. So I had a huge interest in cars. When I got to 19 or 18 or 19, I started obviously buying my first car, modifying, that kind of stuff. And that led on to, you start with your Fiat Punto, and then you've got your terrible Max Power Civic, and you've got your terrible Max Power 10 or 12 cars after that. And it gets more extreme. And then in Ireland, a lot of car culture is based on insurance, because insurance is so high here, or even if they would at the time, insure you or not. So when I got a little bit older, the insurance prices, as they got a little bit more achievable, I started moving into performance cars, which led me into the Skylines, the Silvias, the Evos, all the Japanese stuff. I think I probably had, I would say 60% of the models that you could availably get probably from Japan, I had at some point or another. between RX-7s. I think I had 4 or 5 Skylines. I had Evos. I had an Impreza. I had a couple of Silvia, PS13s,
So
180s.
were you trading in cars at all, or was that simply just through passion of ownership?
It was pretty much, I mean, I have a very different, and I know this is going to sound quite controversial to the general person in drifting, but I have a short attention span with cars. And I also feel like I like experiencing different cars. I'm not super niche. So I didn't go, I have a Corolla. That's all I'm ever going to want is a Corolla. I would have that for a certain time. I would explore the car. I would test it. I would do it, whatever I could do with it. And then I would go, right, let's go try something completely different. And I would just kind of cycle through those cars. And I was pretty good at wheeling and dealing in terms of part exchanges. And a lot of those cars were swapped back in the day. Swaps were a big thing because someone would, lose interest in their car and you'd lose interest in yours and you'd do a swap and away you go. So I bartered my way up, up the ladder and eventually had some really, really nice cars. And that, of course, led me to the belief that rear-wheel drive Japanese cars were the most fun cars to own. And, of course, you buy a car like a PS13 with an element of drift spec on it, you naturally start looking towards drifting. And I had a very casual sort of interest in drifting, I would say, from early on. More so, I have obviously watched, all the option stuff from Japan, and I'd started to watch, the Drift Bible and things like this. But I never really had a massive interest in competitive drifting. It was more on a casual grassroots level. I did some practice days. I had some fun. And competitive drifting was quite, I suppose, I think a lot of people will feel this. If it's out of your league of being able to do it, you start not having as much of an interest in it. You're very focused on what you're doing. And that was,
because
cheap.
It becomes less fun, yeah.
Exactly. So it was cheap fun, part warns, drive. I drove to every practice day, did my skids, broke a bumper, taped it back up, drove home, that kind of thing. No trailer, no van. And as time progressed, I had at the time, in 2000 and I'm not sure, like 8 or 9 maybe, I had an R34 Skyline, which is a 4-door, and it was Ken Nomura's old car, which was from Tokyo Auto Salon. So it had been imported into Ireland. I bought the car. And there was a car show on in Punchestown. And they were like, bring the car down, put it on a stand. I said, cool. And then I was there with the car. I actually watched for the first time ever, because this is before live stream. So you didn't just happen to watch Irish drifting or any drifting at the time because you were flicking on your phone. You would physically have to go and watch it. So that was the first time I was physically there. And it's quite an influential day because I actually stood, because it was so busy, I stood on a wheelie bin to try and see the actual action that was going on. And I was standing on a wheelie bin, and on the wheelie bin beside me was Eddie Power, who would end up becoming the commentator for the Irish Drift Championship and now the current owner of the Irish Drift Series. So the two of us stood on 2 wheelie bins watching it, blown away, just couldn't understand what was going on, had no idea about anything or how it worked or how people were winning or nothing, but we just loved it. So from that particular point on, we made it our mission to go to those events for the next while. And then it sort of, as I was in the car forums, I was working as a DJ at the time. Even though I was college educated, I was still becoming a child and saying I don't want to get a real job. So I wanted to stay DJing. I was DJing maybe 3 or 4 nights a week. And earning pretty okay money, but the usual thing with DJing, you get to a point where you realize you've no social life and every night you're out on the road. So I said, oh, well, what'll I do next? And I hadn't really any idea. And then a guy said to me, hey, they're doing this Pro Drift event in City West, which was the only time they ever held an event there. And there's a car show on. You should bring your car down. You should also do a bit of commentary on the Pro-Am. And at this time, there was no commentary on Pro-Am, which is really hard to imagine, but it was just silence and the whole day of people pointing who won. So they were like, well, we put him in, and what's the worst that could happen? He must be surely better than silence, right? That was literally what I was told on the day. Do whatever you want, and I had no idea. At this point, I didn't even really know who James Dean was. I had an idea. So interestingly enough, the night before, I sat down, I watched a Formula Drift event for the first time. Well, I think about the first time. And I just learned the lingo and what was going on as if I was studying, and sort of translated that and bluffed a lot into the commentary. Then they said, hey, do you want to do the Sunday commentary, which was the pro commentary? I said, hey, why not? So that weekend I went home. I said, hey, that was a fun experience. There was, that's one for the books. That's the end of that. Great. And then at the time, the owner of Pro Drift, Graham McNamara, rang me up and said, hey, do you want to do the rest of the season? I said, you know what? Why not? It was good fun. I enjoyed it. And then it spiraled from there. I started doing more shows, more live events, more exhibitions, that kind of thing. That led to Graham from Pro Drift deciding he wanted to move his business to Dubai and he wanted to start something fresh there. And I said, well, could I run a drift series? And at the time, I had no money. I'd never even done an account in my life. I'd never promoted an event in my life. I'd never done anything, nothing to do with event management whatsoever. And I just said yes, because I was like, right, we'll say yes, and then we'll figure it out before it all happens. And
just completely in at the deep end.
I had no idea. So I wrangled my dad in, who had just retired, and I said, hey, will you do the books and the paperwork? I'll do the promo and the organizing. And the two of us just did everything that first year. And there was only two of us, and we hired in, obviously, with a great team, which we inherited from the ProDrift guys at the time. And we ran a pretty successful season. And then, of course, on my third event, I said, you know what we'll do? We'll invite over Daigo Saito and Robbie Nishida and Matt Powers, and we'll give them all cars, and we'll build a brand new track in Mandela, and we'll go crazy. And we pulled off the first ever Global Warfare. That kind of put Irish drifting on the map. And it was also the first event that was properly live streamed in the history of Irish drifting. So it was all in one weekend. It sort of exploded. The end of that season, we had Chris Forsberg and Vaughan Gittin Jr. in Ireland. It was a very ambitious first year. I nearly thought we were going to lose everything on it, but the gamble paid off. And that gamble then led me to Graham at the end of the year saying, well, I thought you'd make a mess of it, but you actually did a pretty good job. Do you want to come over and run a series in Dubai that we're developing? I said, cool. And there it just spiraled from there over the couple of years. And then the British Drift Championship was another step. If I stay out of the flow, sometimes I forget the whole story, because I'm like, I'll
bring you back. Don't worry. But interestingly for me, as you're running through that, is that actually you ran it with your dad, and he became involved.
He's still involved.
So it's a family affair, as it were. So he's not got any background in motorsport as such,
or in finances or event management,
events or finance or anything.
So both of us sort of split all of this new career and said, right, you figure out how to do all of this, I'll figure out how to do all of this, and we'll somehow make it work. So the wild change of direction is a bit of a hereditary trait, is it? To be honest, for my dad, no. My dad is the most conservative man that's ever lived. I think for him, he had worked in big corporate business all his career. He had very much been a cog in the wheel. And I think this was a way of him feeling a little bit like an entrepreneur without a massive amount of risk. And from the stress and levels and money he was dealing with in his corporate world, this was more fun. And also he wanted a new challenge. He didn't want to just go play golf for 20 years. So he said, let's do something. So he put in crazy hours. And my dad, who retired from a huge corporate job in Ireland, is the guy still collecting, until last year, still collecting, your 20 euros at the gate in an event and stuff, out a high-vis jacket on. So he loves it. It's the social aspect as well for him. So he jumped in new. I jumped in new. We sort of said, let's see what happens in a year. And we definitely didn't plan that we would have any more employees or go outside of Ireland or do anything. I think the only plan for me at the time was, could I make doing a season of Irish drifting just pay me enough to survive? That was pretty much all the focus was that first or second year.
Well, you seem to have survived quite well since then.
Surviving being the key.
Yeah. Well, you've got some quite nice cars now, which we'll maybe come towards at the end. But it's really nice to hear that you've actually been able to do something like that with your dad and continue it for such a long period of time. And again, with Eddie Power, it's almost slightly ironic that you were going to events with him and you ended up being the commentator, and obviously you've almost switched roles at this point. So that's
it's another point we'll come to. Yeah, that's so it's reality now.
Well, it's something I keep saying as I'm talking on the channel, is drifting is a really small group of people. We're quite, the core of drifting all around the world is only a very focused number. So it's quite interesting seeing how everybody ends up sort of having influence on each other. Graham, obviously, that you mentioned earlier, was one of sort of the original founders of drifting right in the early days, working with Kieran that I mentioned in the drift history. So it's very fun to see that all of you guys are still involved in the sport, and even Graham now is still involved in the sport, and it's such an addictive thing.
And we're all still in contact. That's the crazy thing. We all still cross paths all the time. Yeah. Even, 10 years on, it's still crossing paths, opening up projects for each other, opportunities for each other. If you look at, say, the current climate, the last year of Irish drifting I did, Graham's nephew, was Alan Hines was the big star in the show, so it's like generational as well. So, and Graham's brother Darren was running a team of two of the drivers in it. So there's still a lot of those core guys involved, even though I think everyone's role has completely changed from where it was we're still involved in some way, shape, or form.
Well, for myself, I was only thinking the other day about the generations, and actually, I'm probably the first generation, and then there was a second generation where sort of it changed to sort of Glenn Horncastle and D1GB era, and the Pro Drift era, and then you're almost third generation now, where it's come right into the forefront. And I think Drift Masters is potentially another generation again, another generation of growth in the sport. So that's pretty interesting.
I always feel sad that I wasn't there for the first two generations, but it wasn't that I just didn't know it existed. But as I said, I came in quite fresh in 2010, so the world of drifting to me started really in 2010. Whereas I think a lot of things
happened then, but I think they happened very slowly in the grand scheme of things. I think the moment you've come into it is where the full fruition of the sport has come in, because obviously just before you got into it, we had the Fast and Furious Tokyo Drift. So because of that massive growth, and then it's come to you, and then it's grown again. I think that's certainly, you came in at the right time in the right place. So although you missed the early days, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Mostly it was street drifting and.
Yeah, and I said no. I think a big thing then was, in that just before the buyout of BDC, was that I had come in from quite a different perspective than the rest of people in Irish drifting, because a lot of people in Irish drifting had come in from a mechanical background or being a drifter. So I had come in as and this is part of the reason I always say that I'm not as cool as a lot of people in drifting is I didn't come from a mechanical background. I'm also not a hardcore drift aficionado. Like, I'm not from the old school. I don't essentially have all of the knowledge of every single aspect of drifting. So when I came into it, I came in with quite a general approach. And I think that was the difference for us, was that we gave the public a very general approach. We wanted anyone who's into cars to sort of relate to drifting without it being too technical, without it being too clicky. We wanted to kind of be open doors to everybody. And I think that was my sort of influence coming from a marketing perspective rather than a hardcore technical drift perspective. Was more like, okay, Kieran, you handle the technical aspect of judging. I'll handle how do I get enough people to watch this. And that's why we added a lot of, cinematic stuff, humor, international drivers, rivalries that probably didn't exist, but we made them happen in our heads. And, international drivers with this streak and everything. This was stuff, that already existed before me, but I made them more of a WWE storyline so that at least people who had a casual interest could get invested in the characters, even if they weren't 100% invested in the machinery.
And then at that point, once people are in, you can continue to nerd out on the subject, as it were. You can dig and dig and dig until you get, obviously, I'm a super geek, so you can come to where I am. But it's nice that you've made it a lot more open to people, a lot more sort of family oriented, and a bit more of a show. Because thinking back, that's one of the things that drew me to drifting, is that watching the old option videos, it was a show. And I think at some stage the show was lost for the sense of becoming a motorsport. But the show is such a big factor, and that's definitely something you've focused on. And I think as you took over from Graham, that just became more and more prevalent. So, I mean, that's probably around the 2012, 2013 era, where you've then taken over IDC at that stage. Well, it changed from Pro Drift to IDC.
Yeah, there was one year of Irish Drift Championship
until you got to BDC.
Yeah, there was 1 year of Irish Drift Championship where Kieran Hines ran it, and at the end of that year, he sort of said to me, I'm not a marketing guy, I'm a technical guy, and this needs more of a promotional end. So that's when we stepped in, and I took a small loan from my dad. He said, it's the last money you'll ever get from me, so if you waste it, that's the end of that. And I've luckily paid him back in the meantime and hired him as an employee in the meantime. So it worked out pretty good in the long run. But we ended up, we just jumped for the stars on that. And as I said, I was bringing that to the BDC element, was we had brought Irish drifting to such a level of live stream production and showmanship that the guys who were running the British Drift Championship, it wasn't that they didn't want to compete. They just didn't really want to put that level of stress on themselves. I was going over and above what a national series should be. And for the guys, especially, it was Paul McCallum and Mark Buckle, legends of UK drifting, they got to a point where they were like, well, do we really want to amp this up now, in terms of what we're investing and the time and everything else tenfold? or, you know, will we just let Dave continue on this path? And then they gave me a phone call. They asked me about, did I want to take it over? It was a really strange time for me because I actually had been diagnosed with cancer a week before this, which is something I don't talk a whole lot about. And we actually, the day I got diagnosed with cancer, I actually did a premiere for our first documentary, still finished that documentary. So it was an uncertain time for everybody. Luckily, everything worked out great in the end, and it wasn't too big a deal. But it was like a kind of a turning point of like, do we, you know, we're not sure what the future holds. Do we take a big gamble and do Ireland and UK, or do we just keep it what we have? I said, look, we've been gambling this far. Let's just keep going with it. We jumped into the British Drift Championship, and we did 3 great years there. And I really, really enjoyed the British Drift Championship. And I think that is, in some ways, I enjoyed the British Drift Championship in many ways other than other championships, because it was when you got to a point in Ireland where people had almost seen and done everything, especially from a driver point of view, to come into the British Drift Championship where they hadn't had that level of sort of hype and promo and maybe storylines. They were enjoying that. It was like a rebirth for me to go back in there again. And then it just progressed to madness then, where we were doing 6 championships in 12 countries or something by the end of 2018, where I think we were all getting grey hairs and forgetting events and not knowing what's going on.
That is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, what championships were you running at that point?
In 2018, I was running the Irish Amateur Drift Championship, which was a 3 or 4 round championship for amateurs. I was running, obviously, the Irish Drift Championship Pro and Pro-Am. I was running the Emirates Drift Championship. I was also running the British Drift Championship and Drift Masters as well at the same time. So I think I almost killed myself and the boys that year. And by the end of that year, we were like, if we continue to do this, we'll all be dead by 40. So we said we might have to tone back on some areas. But
I think that's something that happens very easily in drifting, is you can overload and burn out. I think from, you know, someone from behind the scenes and having that perspective, it's incredible the amount of work that even turning up and painting lines on the floor of a racetrack, you know, the number of man hours involved. I think people would actually love to see that so they can get a deeper grasp of it. But it's something that's just so overwhelming. And when you're at the helm of that, you know, I've seen organisers not far off having nervous breakdowns at a single event. So how you ran that many events over the space of a year? What was the actual number of events that you ran that year?
I think competitively, it was something like 28 events or something like that. I'm not sure competitively. But on top of that, we were running a drift school. We were also running Drift Games bashes. We were also running practice days. We had other things going on and some media projects outside of that. So we were overloaded, is the right word. And the only way we got through all that was the team of guys I had around me who are just as passionate and talented and would spend the hours unpaid to make sure everything succeeded. So to be honest, where I initially lit the fire, it very much was the rest of the team that carried the torch and allowed us to do all the rest of the things we did. The likes of Josh Holdsworth coming on board. And this guy was knocking out, you know, something like 200 videos a year of drifting, which is unheard of. He was, you know, then we had Keane Leonard come in, who was sort of the organizational piece, where I'm very scattered and have ADHD and jump from like, oh, let's do this. Oh no, there's a fly on the wall. Let's go do this. He was the organizer, the manager that would say, right, look, you can't do all of that. How are we going to, you know, decide what you want to do? And in all of that, we added, you know, from Adam to Mike, who is, you know, really funny guy that sort of brings that level of enthusiasm to the physical work. We added a great team of Adam and Blaine towards the end, and all that team together everyone was complimenting each other. But the most important thing is the bond of banter between everyone and the openness to basically tear each other apart every day, you know, taking the piss, kept us all sane throughout it. You know, we would make fun of all the bad situations rather than being too stressed out. And if it wasn't for those guys, we wouldn't have been able to succeed. And as time went on, I did feel like, you know, it's great to say, you know, you're Lord of the drifting, right? And you're doing all these events and you're in charge of so many things. But it was never my first intention. And a lot of those offers came to me very much from somebody saying, hey, we need a little bit of help. Do you mind doing this? And I was like, well, the one thing people will never realize about drift organizing, which is why very few people do it, is not a huge amount of money in it and there's a lot of risk. So there's a constant element of gambling and pressure. And in order to try and get rid of that, that risk, doing 28 events is the way to do it, because if you lose on 3 and you gain on 3, you know, you're spreading your bets on the roulette table across a lot more numbers. So for me, that was always a way of saying, right, if we've spread all the bets, surely we'll have disastrous wet weekends, and then we'll have great weekends with lots of people and whatever. So that's that year was, especially the addition of Drift Masters, I think we underestimated how much work a European championship is. And I think trying to do them all on top of each other, we got to the end of 2018 and I was very much like, look, I like Europe, I like the UK, I like Ireland, but something has to give. I don't live in the UK. It's very difficult for me to stay in touch with everybody there and do the groundwork on the sponsorships and venues. So that was where, you know, my idea to let that champion, I thought it was in good shape. So like I'd done a good job to leave it in quite a steady shape. So I was going to pass that through to Matt. And Matt was the first person I rang. And it was the only person I rang about taking over that championship, which if he had said no, I would have not been so sure where we were going. But luckily,
got it right the first time.
Yeah, luckily it worked out, and he's done an amazing job. Well, he's done an amazing job in massive adversity in the first 2 years. He had 6 wet weekends and a pandemic. That's where he's still smiling. So if he can get through that, he'll be the best promoter the UK has ever seen.
So that then is 2016, Dave, and obviously, you know, you sort of had your foray with the BDC, but it's like before that. I just want to kind of go back a little bit and have a chat about Niall Gunn, who obviously at the time was running Drift All Stars. Well, he'd run a few events in England, came to Drift All Stars, and then obviously that then again transformed into Drift GP. But I believe he's kind of the guy that sort of set up this very kind of extreme European, that's now become Driftmaster's style of driving, where everybody is a little bit bonkers. But I know you've worked with him previously, you know, one event that I judged out in Birmingham, you know, we were there together. But how was that sort of almost taking what Niall had developed and then sort of reforming that and bringing it into a new product that's obviously become very current? And now I would say, you know, the guys I know all over the world, America, Japan, Australia, Driftmasters is very much seen as the epicenter of crazy people. Because obviously there's talent all around the world, but I think Driftmasters is now a particular type of lunacy. But obviously that's come from Niall. So how was that sort of transition over? And what did you learn from what he'd done previously that you then implemented into what you're doing now?
I think Niall was a very influential character in drifting for quite some time. I think his ambition was what was admired most. When you're a drift organizer, I feel like you've got to go a number of different paths. It's like you're a driver, you know, are you the steady, consistent guy, or are you the wild guy like the Nakamura or the Luke Fink that may not win every competition, but will definitely have, you know, the fans on board, or it's exciting. And I think if you look at, say, for a very long time, a lot of organizers, especially national organizers, were going down a very conservative route, which is the correct route to a certain extent to keep everything being, you know, afforded and paying everybody and everything being consistent every year. Niall very much wanted to push the sport completely beyond that and into new territory. And the stuff that he did in those years were massively memorable. You know, the events he's done on street courses to even, you know, remote control cameras, whatever he had at his disposal, he used. And he was a massive influence, I don't think, just on European drifting, but also on world drifting, because he was pushing the boundaries. Now, in pushing those boundaries, sometimes the boundaries push back and you have certain things that don't go to plan. And I think Niall suffered a little bit of that at times, not because of his ability, but also because of how difficult it was what he was doing to pull off. There was like, you know, 20% chances this was all going to work perfectly, and he would take them for the sake of the sport. So he was a massively influential character. The difference when we moved to Driftmasters is that Driftmasters had been doing a Polish championship for a number of years, spending an awful lot of money on production. And again, it was in Polish. So the only audience that were going to watch that drift event was Polish people. So they had a very good Polish championship, but were spending European money. And Niall was in a situation where he was transitioning into other things as well. And I think the opportunity arose that Driftmasters could go further. And of course, with one thing which drifting very rarely has, and I would say this is universal across the world, is financial backing to take a chance. And that's something that drifting doesn't really usually have. It's generally, you know, the organizers scraping the driver entries together with and hoping X amount of people come through the gate, or, you know, they're in trouble. With Driftmasters, they had a certain amount of investment from the parent company to say, let's take a chance on this and, let's invest it without having to return it 2 or 3 weeks later. Let's put it in for a year or 2 or 3 and see where it goes. And I think that comfort, which drifting has never had, allowed me to step in and have early meetings with them and say, well, if you want to invest, here's what I would do. And the one thing I have to be very cautious of is it wasn't my investment, so I couldn't lose it on them either. And of course, Eric, who's the president of Driftmasters, also very similarly didn't want to, gamble it all away. And I think when we came into Driftmasters, we just said, look, it's kind of the last, if we were going to make it a European Championship, and I think to do better than anything that had been done before, you were going to have to get the best of everybody together. They're not cheap. You're going to have to get the best tracks together. That's not cheap. You're going to have to do things that are out of the box, like stadium events, which is certainly not cheap. And you're going to have to take a gamble that you do a year and you impress everybody enough that you get some financial backing from that point on to keep doing it. Otherwise, it's just a big loss maker. And the first year was a big gamble. 2 football stadium events in a 6-round championship is ridiculous. And then you've got all this, extra media, extra live stream. And at the end of that first year, we kind of said, hey, we might be onto something here. And then the partnership with Red Bull came on board at that point to even enhance it more. So with Red Bull in your corner, with a larger financial investor from the parent company, you now have this power where you're not just doing what you can afford, you're doing whatever you want to make it better. Not flippantly spending it just to get rid of it, but you're trying to make it as good as possible for the public and for the guys watching. And I think last year's Driftmasters was probably a starting point for what's possible with drifting in the future, of venue versus presentation versus professionality, but still having that element of fun and risk involved and that bit of humor. I thought last year's Driftmasters was the best championship I've been involved in from start to finish in terms of a package. And that's sort of, when you get to that level, it's difficult to go back to the national level, a week later and say, right, now I'm going to take a massive financial risk myself on this. And I can't keep up everyone's expectations. And also the gamble of money all the time and the loss of money. That's where it brought me to the decision last year of saying maybe the forefront of where this is going, I should concentrate there instead of trying to spread myself thin across, spread myself thin across 20 different things. Maybe focusing on one is more beneficial in the long run. And that was the decision that I chose to leave Irish drifting behind last year. You
haven't left completely though, have you? I mean, you're still running the Drift Games events, but obviously they're all at Mondello. So I'm assuming it's a fairly, I wouldn't say simple, but it's the same formula for each event. So how many events, Drift Games events?
We do four bashes a year. And luckily for us, we have a very good relationship with Mondello. So we can kind of get away with a bit more than anyone else would, because they trust us and we have great staff, so they can control it to a certain extent. So if we take 100 drivers in and divide them into 3 tracks and keep it all, it looks mental, but there's a certain level of organized chaos to it, a little bit of a party, a bit of fun. And for us, I've always found that, especially in Ireland, any negativity that I draw from drifting, which of course everything has positives and negatives, comes from competitive drifting in Ireland. It's where the negatives come from. In grassroots drifting or practice day drifting, there is no negatives. It's sort of do what you want. It's up to you how fun a day you have. So for me, I didn't want to have a massively stressful job abroad and then come home and have another stressful job at home. I sort of wanted to use the Drift Games brand, the content and the events as sort of a release for the fun side of things, the non-so-serious side of things, to balance the incredible pressure that Driftmasters is at the moment. So it's sort of like a yin and a yang. And I think if we had everything being super high pressure, you just learn to resent it a little bit and get a bit more, it's a job rather than passion and what I'm into. So
I agree with that. Pressure has to come in waves, otherwise it's overwhelming. So.
Exactly. And I think separating it for me of like Drift Games is all about, we don't give a shit what anyone thinks about what cars we like. We don't care that we aren't experts. We just want to have fun with cars, do fun things. Whatever comes into our mind, we do. If people like it, they do. If they don't, they don't. Whereas with Driftmasters, obviously you're trying to make everybody like it. So it's not like you have that choice. So you have to make sure it's perfect and well presented. And, when you're on an event in Driftmasters, it's an incredible amount of work. I would say it is 3 to 4 times the stress levels and work levels of any events I've done before. So to balance that, I think we're at a good place now of fun versus the pressure, which I enjoy, of pushing things forward.
So you get that lunacy of Driftmasters and the high pressure event, and then you still get something where you can go out and you drive yourself. So maybe that's something to come back to now, is that actually through all of this time you have been driving and you are a drifter. So, you know, it's drifting by drifters for drifters, which I think sometimes people can quite easily forget, especially when you're in the pressure of a situation or you feel quite passionate about things. But actually, you know, you have been driving this whole time, and now you have 2 drift cars.
I have 3 drift cars, three
drift cars. Because everyone needs 3, you know.
Everyone says, you know, that phrase people have of "don't get high on your own supply." So I would make money from drifting and then spend it all completely back on drifting, which is a vicious cycle. But I have 3 drift cars at the moment, which I've never had that many drift cars for. That's just kind of, it so happened that way. But for us, a lot of people would wonder, why do I have so many cars and why am I doing up all these different cars? Well, there's a number of reasons for that. Not all of it is that I have lots of money. A lot of the reason is that obviously if you have a company, if you have a company that is based on what we do, one thing we don't have a lot of is assets, because we don't have our own property. We don't have, like, we have a few cameras and some laptops. That's pretty much what the company is run on. So a lot of this was, you know, if we had a bad event or something happened, we had no collateral to put up against any loans or anything that we wanted from the bank. The bank would be like, well, if you guys go bust, what are we going to get? Like some MacBooks and a camera. So a lot of my cars that I purchased were essentially like assets that in case of a rainy day or something went wrong or we had an issue.
Insurance policy.
Exactly. That. So for example, we had a bad, like now we have a bad time and we're not making a lot of revenue. You could always sell a car just to get you through that time or whatever it may be. And a lot of our sponsors were very eager to give us parts and stuff without giving us revenue. So I was like, okay, well, at least if someone gives me some wheels as a sponsorship deal, I can't just go selling the wheels again. That's completely immoral. So at least if I was building a car in the background with all of those parts, at least it's worth something to me to use for content or for driving, or down the line, it's worth something to sell. So a lot of it seems very flashy, but a lot of it has a lot of sense behind the scenes of trying to build our sponsorships and our sort of any expendable income we have into assets that can sit there, and at any given moment we could always, you know, sell them. Or and the thing is, if you have money in the bank, you can't make content with that. You can't, you know, go drifting with that. You can't do anything with that. So these assets were essentially also earning money by going out and drifting and getting deals and having fun for videos and stuff. So it was kind of a little bit more of a clever way of doing it, I think.
So if you were to offer any drifters out there who are thinking about organizing events advice, it would be that you should probably be slightly sensible in what you're doing rather than just firing everything into the car and into corners.
I would say, you know, from my perspective, I've always looked at 2 things that are major issues in drifting, which is always the same 2 things. The first one is grassroots versus competition. And somehow there's an argument there that people say one is better than the other when I see them as completely different things. And then money, right? So that's the second thing. If you're not in an argument about whether competitive drifting is crap, you're in an argument about money and how much drifting costs. The interesting thing about those 2 things, and what I've always advised people, is if you're modifying your car, you're into cars, and the reason you get into that is you like it yourself. And if you're spending your own money on something, then do it at your level for yourself and for whatever you want to get out of it. I don't think it's the same with organizing. If you want to get into organizing events because you think it's fun and you want to have fun and do a good thing, keep it simple, keep it, you know, fun. If you want to go and be the best in the world, there's a gamble on that. And the gamble is that it costs a lot more money, there's a lot more risk, and you're not going to get it easy. So whether you're a driver or an organizer, if you want to just have fun drifting, there's a literal step-by-step guide to how to do that, cheap and fun. If you want to run a practice day or a small event, there's literally a million people have done it before. It's easy. Look at their model. It'll work. Try and run big things, big cars, 1,000 horsepower, you know, and all that kind of stuff. And you think that's fun to try and be the biggest star you can. Or if you're an organizer and you want to push it to an incredible level, you have to accept that you may lose a lot of money because the reward is so high. The risk is so high. So I think that over drifting, all of my years doing it, the biggest thing I've learned is do what's right for you. Don't overstretch to impress anybody else. Do it what's right for you. Have fun with it. Whether you're a driver, organizer, commentator, vlogger, whatever it is, just do what's you and what you like. Don't try and do it for other people's benefit And if you do it for other people's benefit, you'll end up resenting it in the long run anyway. So it's best to just have fun. And that's the whole point of it. As complicated as you may make it, I may make it, in drifting, when we break it down, at the bottom level, it's just having fun with cars. It doesn't make any fucking sense as a sport. It doesn't make any sense as a hobby or a passion. Stop trying to make it make sense. It's about having as much fun in the car as you can. And when you lose that in any way, shape, or form, whether it's on any level of drifting, I think that's the time to step away or reassess what you're doing. And I think if you get that level of self-awareness, which is difficult in drifting, people get carried away and their self-awareness goes out the window. You can see those people struggling to figure out what to do with it. And I think you need to reassess. And that's why I have fun cars. That's why I have pro cars. That's why I have an SR20, because I want to. Do you know what I mean? It's not because it's the most competitive or it's the most Japan or whatever it is.
Careful.
But you know what I mean? It's not, if I wanted to go win a championship, it's not what I would pick. But I like the car. I like the way it handles. I like driving it. So I'm just going to do that. It doesn't bother me how I do, as long as I'm having a fun weekend.
I think that's incredibly good advice. And actually, especially at the top end, excuse me, of the sport, you've got, guys, I was chatting to Frederick Asbo the other day, and he's a prime example of somebody who absolutely loves what he does and is still very realistic about his expectations. I think that's why people like that are so successful, because they keep that grasp on reality and self-awareness of the situation. But going through that, and obviously, relating to yourself, what would you sort of consider to be the most difficult times that you've been through from both the driver's perspective and an organizer's perspective, coming through all these years of drifting? Because it's nice to kind of look at the rosier side of it. Yeah. But obviously there's some points where you've made mistakes that are often quite difficult to possibly to live with. What would they be, and how would you steer people away from making those same mistakes from both sides of that coin?
Well, I've made more mistakes than I've got right. I'm just really good at hiding them. Like I'm a good it's like, I just get rid of them and never mention them again. So as an organizer, the biggest mistakes you can make as an organizer, I think, is taking things too personally. In drifting, you're going to have a bunch of, 100 people, all different opinions, different characters. And the thing about drifting is a lot of drifting is talk. And, because you're spending so much time in a garage or a shed building with your friends, or you're on the road or whatever. So discussing it happens a lot more, or opinions in drifting happen a lot more than the actual driving does. So people can get quite, big assumptions of you as a person, or, anything like that. And for me, over the years, I think when someone criticized what I'd done, I would take it very personally and start to work out, okay, how do I fix this? How does this one person's problem, how do I get his problem to be fixed? And it was almost like spinning plates. If you imagine every driver was a spinning plate, you'd keep one happy for a week, but then another one would start falling down and you're running around all the time. And I think over the years, I realized that, you can't keep everyone happy. And I think if you're even building a car, you're not going to keep everyone happy. And you have to accept that before you do it, or before you do anything in a public forum, whether it's a video or a drift car you're building and putting it up on Instagram, or it's an event you're running. People are not going to like what you're doing. That's because your taste is different than theirs. And that's what you have to accept before you do it. And then it doesn't become as hard over time. So I think anyone in public event organizing, criticisms are going to be something you're going to get a lot. And you have to believe that you're doing the right thing rather than constantly justify yourself. Because if you spend your whole life justifying yourself to other people, it's an incredibly tiring process. From driving, I think my most frustrating time was when I started drifting, because I just couldn't get it. I just couldn't get drifting for about 2 years. I could do a bit of a skid to a point. I just couldn't get it. I kept spinning. I do qualifying runs in battles where I'm like, what am I doing here? I didn't do this all morning. Now here I am over here pulling the handbrake. Or I get on the line and stress myself out going, oh, I'm on a first gear, second. I'm like talking through the run going, I didn't do any of this in practice. And now I'm breaking it down. And so nerves is a big thing. And then there was a time, I think it was when I bought my SR20 powered Corolla and I did BDC that year, where I went to the first round and I was spending quite a bit of money to go to BDC at this point. And my girlfriend said to me, are you going to do the whole season? And I said, you know what? I don't even really want to do the whole season. I think I'll just do this round. And if I do shit, that'll be that. And I'll be happy enough for that, save the money. Excuse me. And because I had such low expectations, I didn't care less about qualifying. And it was I bought the car on a Sunday. I went to this event on the Thursday, so I'd never even driven the car. And I never set it up, did no alignment, nothing, tire pressures, nothing, just drove out. Didn't care less, qualified second. It's the best I'd ever qualified. And that year I did the best I'd ever done, because every round I was like, well, I'm sort of in the championship now, don't care. And even if I do crap, I'm happy enough to be here having a bit of fun anyway. And I took the stress away from myself. But I think it happens, and it happens differently for every driver. There just becomes a day when you go, I get it. I get it now. I get what's going on. I've figured it out. And for some people, it can take like 10 years to get to that point. And I'm still watching them trying to get to that point.
Yeah.
And then for other people, it takes a week. But I don't think once you get there, it makes any difference when you got there. As long as you get there at some point, and I think that's the perseverance of learning, to get there and keep challenging yourself and keep learning. One day you get there and you go, I know what I'm doing. I'm not an idiot anymore. And now I can push on with more advanced skills. And I think for me, the most difficult time is before you get to that day where you go, I know what's happening. I know how to do this. I can drift any corner, any track. It doesn't bother me. That's a really frustrating time, because you're watching everybody else be better than you and you're getting very frustrated about it. But it does come for every driver. It comes at some point where they go, okay, I can do this now. I'm happy. I'm learning. And that's, from an organizer and driver's perspective, those are my two sort of most difficult things, I think, or my advice I would give to people.
So it's a difference between being there to prove something and being there to just enjoy the process of, building a car and putting tires on it and getting on the track and driving.
Absolutely.
The simplicity of it.
You have to enjoy losing as much as winning and drifting, or what's the point? Like, you have to enjoy just being involved, because, as I say at the one thing I say at every single briefing I've ever given is, there's 80 guys here. One of them's going to win. Everyone else here is going to lose. So if you can accept that you've got a 1 in 80 chance of winning the event, and probably less if you're not the best guy there, you have to just accept that and be happy with whatever happens. And as long as I say to guys, you leave an event and you've learned something, even if it's tighten your wheel nuts more, even if it's have more water before you go in qualifying because you feel better, even if it's a tiny irrelevant thing you've learned, take away something that you're driving home going, I learned something today, that's better than I was the last day, and that's all that matters. And then you always have a positive to go home on.
I think that's brilliant advice, and a very decent outlook, and one that I would argue is shared by, again, all of the successful drivers that I know, and even down to guys who only drive for fun. That's something they all maintain, is just that enjoy the whole process and don't be so hard on yourself. I think there's quite a lot of judgment in the sport at the moment where people are learning and they're feeling very judged and sort of ostracized by people who have some capability of driving. But the process of learning is something that's kind of very frowned upon. I think that's quite a sad thing for the sport right now. But advice like yours is something that will combat that and just allow people to actually enjoy the journey of drifting, rather than just, am I, on the number one spot on the podium? Because it's not generally just about that, is it? So
no, I think the first time I did a drift event was 10 years ago. And I think right now, this is the only time in that 10 years that I feel I'm a pretty good driver. I know that sounds very arrogant, but I mean, I was very bad.
That's relatable. That's relatable. And that's
so like 10 years of driving different cars, different practice days, different tracks. Only now do I feel confident enough to go and compete that I am not terrible or going to make a big mistake or end up on my roof. Like, I'm pretty happy I can get around a track now. And that's taken 10 years. And I've been in the sport full time for 10 years almost. Well, 6 or 7 years. So I'm very exposed to it. So it doesn't happen easy for everybody. And I don't think people need to be afraid that they're not good at drifting, because if everybody was good at drifting, it's kind of what I say, if everyone's good at drifting, it'd be very easy. So, there would be no benefit in being good at drifting because everyone can do it. So, take pride. If you're a good driver, take pride in it, but don't look down on other people who aren't, because it is tough. And if you're telling other people, if you're a good driver and you're telling other people that they're crap, you're basically saying that what you are doing should be easy. So it doesn't make sense as a statement. So what you're saying, if it doesn't make logical sense. And then at the same time, it's the same with car appearance. I always say, well, if everybody had exact replicas of the low origin guy's car, their car would be boring as hell. So there's no point in having everybody judging everybody. Some people will get it right. Some people will get it wrong. I've had some pretty shady cars in the past that when I look back, were terrible. you try and correct that with knowledge as you go. But even building cars, you learn as you go. So you built your first car, it was amazing and looked great, and you went out and you were James Dean, well then it's not that hard to be a drifter. And I think it would demean from everybody who is good if that was as easy as that.
Well, you're then the guy that should be really pushing the level and taking the sport into the future. Guys like James and Dwayne McKeever. I mean, Dwayne's driving I love because he's an absolute lunatic, whereas James is incredibly accurate and precise. And, there's those guys do actually continue to push because they bounce off each other, and that's all part of the development of drifting. Well, always
remember that James Dean, Dwayne McKeever, Frederick Asbo, all of those guys we name, never judge anybody, are never negative, and would never ever say they're the best drifter around. So there's a lot of things to take from those guys that I think can be very relative to everybody in drifting.
They're probably lessons that I should learn myself at some point as well. But on that note of moving forwards to the future, what is next for Dave Egan? What's next for Driftmasters? Where are we going from here? Because obviously it is a difficult time that we've all got to get through, and obviously you're going to make your own announcements on that. But certainly, what are your hopes and dreams for the future, or realistic expectations, however you'd like to put it?
So what does the future hold? I mean, to be honest, it's the same as it always has been. What can I do to keep doing this and afford to keep doing it is all we really think about. I don't have any grand plans to take over anything or be bigger or anything. To be honest, maintaining what we have now is, an income from doing what we love is pretty much all I care about. I don't particularly want to be any poorer or richer or anything than I am now. I just want to be constantly at the forefront of drifting, like with Driftmasters is a big part of it for me personally, to be pushing new ground. With Driftmasters, we're only scratching the surface of what's available there. We worked with a technical team from Germany in conjunction with Red Bull to basically bring digital enhancements to drifting for a casual fan. So very much like a computer game, this scoring system is almost taking away the barrier that people have of watching drifting for the first time and going, what's going on? So we've been working heavily on that. And that to me is exciting because you're trying new things. With Driftmasters, we're going to try and keep pushing to get the best drivers in the world to one championship. I'm not going to give too much away, but there is conversations with other large drift organizations to try and do some collaborative events, which would be incredible. In Ireland and in what we're doing with Drift Games, we want to just keep having fun. I mean, we're not the super, niche guys into Japanese cars. We're kind of into a bit of everything. And, there is ways of us getting more views and ways of us getting more stuff, but it's not us. So I just wanted to make a channel where it's us doing what we like, having a bit of fun with it. And if people vibe with it and it gives them a laugh and they have a bit of fun with it, then that's all that is. And Drift Games, our bashes are amazing fun. I look forward. It's an event that I actually look forward to every time it comes around because you get to party, you get to chat, you get to drift. It's everything kind of relaxed for a weekend. So I love doing those. We still want to teach people how to drift. I mean, that's a big part of what we do at the school, and the Drift Games experience. Seeing 13 and 14-year-old kids coming in, have no idea what's going on, still get a buzz off that, seeing people coming through from amateur level. Also, one big thing for me is I want to get driving. I want to be a drifter. I know that sounds very, very interesting. I've kind of gone carting the horse on this, but I really want to be a drifter because obviously I've been admiring these guys for, 10 years. And I think it's my dream now to go out and be one of those guys. That's pretty much what it is. I want to be, I'm not saying I want to be world champion, but I want to be a semi-respected driver that, I'm not sure, but that can compete and have fun and entertain people and do it his own way and bring a little bit of, behind the scenes of that. That's a huge part of it for me at the moment. It's just, I've watched so much bloody drifting now at this stage. I want to just get involved on the ground level as well.
Yeah. I'm personally looking forward to driving with you because it's been a long time coming. I mean, I think pretty much I sort of stopped drifting competitively as you began drifting competitively. So, it'd be a nice battle of the generations.
It'll be fantastic. We got two SR20s singing around Teesside on the bank.
Beautiful.
Be a great. I'll get the boys there for the photo. We'll put it up on the wall and be like, "Here's the generation gap." Hopefully the gap isn't too big on the actual battle, but it would be pretty.
Well, we need the three of us. Someone from the second generation in the middle.
Yes. We'll get a Pete Nielsen in there. He's second. Well, he would be probably early generation maybe as well.
Perfect.
Yeah, we'll have three SR20s.
Middle.
Yes, we'll have three SR20s.
Yeah, a wonderful noise. You know how I feel about them, so that's all good with me. Interestingly for me, and a bit of a sort of school project type question, but who would you actually like? If you could pick 3 drivers from anywhere in the world to come and compete in Drift Masters, who would they be, and why would you choose them?
Who would I pick? Well, I mean, obviously the 3 drivers I would pick, if I'm an organizer and a promoter, are going to be the 3 guys that bring the most amount of attention, because that's what you're trying to do. I think Nakamura is a no-brainer. I think he is. I call him the sort of the leader of the old school, like as in he's that guy that if you're an OG drift fan, and you've stayed at the grassroots level and that's where you're passionate about, he's sort of the leading light there. I know now he's moved into competition stuff and he's coming along that way back to that level, but his excitement level of driving style, I think the fact that he's quite an interesting character, his style of cars, everything is very synonymous with him. And I don't think there's a drift fan in the world that isn't aware of who he is or his car with the color scheme or whatever it may be. So I think he brings an element. And also having a Japanese driver enter the fray when it comes to a European championship that's now at one of the highest levels, it's always interesting to see how it stacks up. So that's one of my choices. Second choice would obviously be Mad Mike. I mean, the guy just brings so much hype. His car is amazing. I've never heard his car in the flesh. That's a selfish reason of me bringing him, but I do want to hear a rotary around somewhere like, Riga on full throttle would be incredible. And I think obviously his personality, he's a big personality and he brings a lot to the show in terms of, hyping things up. And who else would I pick as a third driver to bring to Drift Masters? Probably a controversial one, but I've always felt that one man that never fails to bring any hype is Luke Fink. I think he always brings something to an event, whether it's a good story or a bad story. He'll bring something along the line in terms of wild driving, and that's what And I think also he has a very passionate following from Australia in that drift scene, so they would be clued in. I mean, with Mitch Larner, we had sort of come from nowhere to be quite a big star in our championship in Ireland, and hopefully now moving on to Drift Masters. The Australian fans are pretty passionate, so bringing those guys on board would be pretty cool as well. So those 3, I mean, honourable mentions along the way of, Vaughn Gittin Jr. brings a lot of hype, brings a lot of presence as well. The American style coming to Europe is something we haven't really seen before, of bringing, a proper American driver like a Forsberg or a Turk or in their own cars, in their own program. And of course, Freddie, he's the one guy I think that's missing at the moment of who should be there. And I think he'd enjoy himself as well. He would. He loves going wild. So there's a list of guys that I'm not saying it would be dream stuff, but I'm not saying is unlikely that it might not happen in the future. I quite like how speculative that statement was. And I think that's a very poignant point to end the conversation on. So yeah, a little teaser. A little teaser, yeah. And that's, again, what we're looking for is looking to move drifting into the future. And just, I think that when we've got guys like yourself behind the helm, I think it's good for people to know where you're coming from and what your mentality is, and that you still have such a passion for the sport. And you clearly love drifting and driving and all the same things that everybody else does, whether they're driving an E36 with a welded diff or a 1,000 horsepower professional level car. I think it's very easy to lose the connection between those things. And conversations like this, I think, really help that, because I'm sort of more grassroots end of the scale, and you're like right up at the top of there with Drift Masters, and that connection is still there and it's still very relevant, and it's still something that everybody involved in drifting can connect to. So I think that people need to realize that everyone in drifting is exactly the same, and stop looking at their car or what they do as any differentiator from that. As I said, it's not the guys who have some of the most expensive cars I've met are some of the most humble and nicest guys in the world, that just so happen to be quite successful and have decided to spend that amount of money on their car. It's not that they feel better than anybody else, or that I've seen world champions driving absolute heaps at practice days and having just as much fun. So I think there is no gap. I think you choose your path like everyone does. But I think everyone in drifting is essentially the same. And regardless of what side of the fence you sit on, there isn't really a fence in the first place. And always remember that 95% of the general public don't give a shit about what we're doing at all. So if we're going to be 5% of lunatics spending money on cars, you might as well stick together if you're only 5%.
Exactly, yeah. So is there anywhere you would like to direct people at the end of this little chat? Or anywhere they can find out more information? Well,
obviously, look, the Driftmaster social media channels and stuff, we're still working on what's happening in 2020, and announcements will be coming quite soon on that. It's difficult for everybody at the moment. In terms of the meantime, is what we're calling it. I'm calling life at the moment. Meantime, is basically we're trying to do as much fun stuff as we can with Drift Games. We're doing a documentary at the moment, which comes out every Monday, which the guys are putting a lot of work in, which is a real behind the scenes look called Smoke and Mirrors of what we essentially was our last year of running Irish Drift Championships last year. It gets very in depth. It's very behind the scenes. It makes me very nervous about how honest a lot of the stuff in it is. But we said if we didn't tell the story now, we never would tell the story. So that's coming out every Monday. It's
it'll be on Monday 8:00, so it's right after this episode. So
exactly,
there's a whole evening. We better keep this below an hour for you.
Yeah, keep it, and then head over to watch Smoke and Mirrors. And if you've not had enough of me giving out about how difficult drift events are, you can get another hour of it after this. So I'm going to come across very negative by the end of it. But as I said, it's something fun we're working on. We're doing a lot of stuff with Drift Games just to have a laugh, have a bit of fun. It's not too serious. So if you guys are you're similarly to yourself, we're just kind of trying to ease people's tensions, have a bit of fun, have a bit of chat, and hopefully pass a bit of time when it's difficult to do so.
Well, that's absolutely brilliant, Dave. Really appreciate what you're doing. I watched the first episode of Smoke and Mirrors. It is excellent. So anyone who's watching really does need to stay on and just move over to that channel and watch what they're doing, because, I know what you guys are like. You Irish boys like to test us and put things out there and see how we react. Yeah. So I can imagine that if the reaction's not too bad, that's only going to escalate through the series. But I really appreciate your time, Dave. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, maybe when we've had a drift season, we'll have you back on and we can sort of go back and review that and see how we all felt about it. But
I can come back on and tell you how bad I did and how it's all someone else's fault. That's where I'm heading at the end of the season.
Well, hopefully it'll be my fault and I'll have crashed into you or something. But anyway, thank you very much, Dave. Great to have you here, and I wish you all the best in the future.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you having me on. We'll see you guys later.
So that was the episode with Dave Egan. I hope you enjoyed it. He's a real interesting cat to talk to. So it was nice for me, particularly to kind of find nice, relatable points with him. I have worked with Dave in the past, and he steers a good ship. So if you didn't know who he was before this episode, well, I'm probably glad that you know who he is now, because he puts a hell of a lot of work in, as do his team. You can witness some more of that work right after this episode, because Dave is going on to the Drift Games channel at 8 p.m. and they're putting out the next episode of something called Smoke and Mirrors, which is a series behind the scenes of the Drift Games series. Potentially some of the Drift Masters stuff. I'm not quite sure what's thrown in there, but it's the real nitty gritty of drifting, what it means to people, and what it actually takes to be involved in the sport at a high level where the pressure is increased. Again, if you did enjoy the episode, it's real nice if you like and share it. That's fine, you can do whatever you want there. But what I really would like is that you comment and you interact, and we all share drifting together. You speak about it, you have questions. I'll certainly answer the questions. Maybe I can rope Dave into answering a couple of them as well. And just keep sharing that information and sharing that love. This channel is all about everybody being involved in drifting and not just like being at the top or the bottom. So it's all good if you want to like and share and subscribe and all those sorts of things. But actually, I think what's more important is that you comment, you interact, and we all sort of share drifting together. If you comment and you ask a question, I will take the time to respond and give you an answer. And maybe I can rope Dave into doing that as well. Drifting is for all of us. I'm sick of seeing the weird sort of hierarchy that people create. We're all just doing the same thing that we love together. It's for fun. You've got to enjoy it. So leave a comment, interact, and share the drifty love. And I'll see you next week, because hopefully I will have fixed what I'm doing wrong with this. I mean, I should have fixed it by now in this, what I'm filming now, but hopefully by next week it'll be all the way through. Bye.